Hello? Hello! Good morning. Good to see everybody here. You know what? Whenever you come into a space like this and nobody's sitting next to each other and then everybody's spread out, for the ladies who are presenting today, it's just harder to sort of see everybody, especially there's a bright light here. So I'd really be grateful, like very grateful, if you all don't mind just sort of moving down to the front, those of you who are in the back. I just think it's a more, I don't know, intimate atmosphere. Better for discussion. So if you don't mind, just humor me on this. Please come on down. And we're about to get started. There are a few people that are still filtering in, but by the time you all come on down toward the front, then we'll be ripper and ready to go. Yeah, it's just like in school. Yes, it is. Thank you for doing that. Here, I can get this out of your way. This is me.
Oh, no problem.
All righty. So thank you for humoring me on moving up front. I appreciate it. And so I'd like to welcome all of you this morning. I'm delighted to see the turnout that we have. And this is our community discussion on some of the challenges of disparity of treatment and disproportionate impact on minority youth and families. So my name is Dana Moylan Wright. I'm a judge of the Circuit Court for Washington County, and I'm very honored today to be serving with a brilliant and creative group of individuals and agencies that are making up the Washington County Crossover Youth Policy Initiative. Now, just as a little entree here, I think all of us who work with challenged children and families in our community, we know there are some struggles that we have in that work. Any of us who do that work can get discouraged at times because of what seem like insurmountable challenges that these families and these children grapple with day in and day out. I have a quote, and I'm going to read it to you, and I would like you all to guess, if you know or if you can guess, who said this. Children now love luxury. They have bad manners, contempt for authority. They show disrespect for elders and love chatter in place of exercise. Children are tyrants, not the servants of their households. They no longer rise when elders enter the room. They contradict their parents, chatter before company. They gobble up dainties at the table, cross their legs, and tyrannize their teachers. Now, does anybody know where that quote comes from? I have no volunteers. Oh, you know? Oh, good for you. Well, Daniel, tell me. Yes, that quote came from Socrates in the 5th century before Christ. And so, we all know that while working with kids can seem challenging, it also was challenging 2,108 years ago. Things haven't changed that much. Kids are kids, right? But the good news is that we do have a bunch of energetic and motivated individuals and agency in our area and elsewhere who understand that children of today are going to be running our community tomorrow. When those children are supported and when we help them get onto a positive path, they strengthen our community. However, if we have children, if they have a shaky foundation of safety within their families and in their community as young children, when they experience traumatic events and at times are living in a family culture that struggles to support their positive progress, they can struggle from a very early age to be on a path that's productive. If kids experience older siblings, parents, and adults around them who suffer from untreated chronic mental illness or chronic substance abuse, and adults who are making choices that end up leading to court involvement or incarceration, those events are incredibly destabilizing to the children and to the entire family. A basic feeling of safety, trust in others, and faith in a positive future can end up severely compromised for these youth. Despite having a supportive and a positive educational environment, and we do have a fabulous school system here in Washington County, particularly a fabulous school led by Tim Morrow, who deals with some of our most challenged youth. But despite all that, at times we have parents who are either unable, because of challenges that they have, or unwilling sometimes to consistently get their children to school. And when that happens, that child's opportunities narrow significantly in terms of what their future possibilities are. At times, the combination of challenges that these young people and their families face lead to involvement with delinquency court, and that can lead to temporary detention if a youth is found to be a danger to themselves or others. It can lead to out-of-home placement, out of home and out of their community, and out of the area where they have what people love them and support them. However, while all of us would like to hope those out-of-home placements sort of provide support and skills and are a fix, we all know that many times being pulled out of the home and out of the community can be traumatizing in and of itself. We all know that despite our best efforts in that out-of-home placements, we're also doing some damage at the same time that we remove children from the community. At times, a combination of challenges that the family experiences can lead to unsafe parenting, and we have those cases that are born of abuse or neglect. Or at times, there's a youth whose mental health challenges are so great that it outstrips the parents' and the family's ability to cope, and that's when the Department of Social Services may get involved with a youth. And in that system, a youth again may end up with an out-of-home placement. Despite best efforts with the foster care system and such, it's just a fact that at times those youth struggle because of the out-of-home placements, because of being separated from those with whom they are attached, with their parents and the other adults in their lives. We've all seen youth coming out of placements, whether it's a Department of Juvenile Services placement or a Department of Social Services placement, and they can come out of that going home and they look bright and they look hopeful and they're excited to be reunited with their family and their communities. And then we see those same youth who, when they return to the family that's been struggling and is still likely engulfed in major struggles, and a community that's struggling and is immersed in struggles, we see those children start to flounder again. People wonder at times about our growing gang problem, even in a small community like Washington County. And I would suggest that if any one of us, including myself, if we grew up with significant trauma, a chaotic home life, few positive adult role models, if any, and a home and a community mired down with drug use and mental illness that's untreated, a mistrust of most of the people in this room, including me, and with little positive opportunity, and ultimately nothing to lose, any one of us, and probably most of us, would be card-carrying gang members because it's a group that offers to, quote, take care of them, despite what they may have to do and the risks that they take to be part of it. And the challenges are great. And we know that the youth and the families in our most challenged communities, they struggle more than those in our stable communities. Any one of us who works with these families and with these children need to make all efforts to ensure that our systems actually support positive progress and that our systems are not, in some unintended ways, reinforcing the cycles of dysfunction and struggle. We have challenges with disparate impact on minority youth in this community. And that's true in both our delinquency system and our child welfare systems. There are challenges also with disparity of treatment within those systems. Now, none of us walked into our jobs or our roles in this community working with family and youth to see it fail or to not see any forward movement. Every one of us wants positive progress, and every one of us wants a child of today to be a healthy and happy and law-abiding citizen of tomorrow. To achieve that goal, we need to gain a better understanding than what we have of the dynamics of disparate impact on minority youth and disparity of treatment within our agencies and within our systems. Struggling to turn a page, hold on. Thank you. Our discussion today is partly generated because on the state level, the Administrative Office of the Courts for Maryland, the Department of Juvenile Services, and on the local level, our Washington County Department of Social Services, I'm sure the state level, I just don't know that group of individuals as well. But those three agencies teamed up and are engaged with and seeking help from Georgetown University to try to address some of the policy changes and strategies that we really need to see unfold in our community with the guidance from Georgetown University, and that is what generated the Crossover Youth Policy Initiative. Our discussion is also possible because in Washington County we have a great and really energetic group of local agency leadership, both public and private, who are working to be creative, to be innovative, to try to look for positive progress and make things better than they are today. The Crossover Youth Policy goal is for the courts, Department of Social Services, Department of Juvenile Services, and other public and private agencies to take a really deep dive into this issue and to collaborate so that we better understand all of the challenges and the struggles that minority youth and their families face, both after they get involved, both after they get involved in the court system on either the DSS or the DJS side, but also before they get involved in the court system to try to prevent their involvement. The goal is to recognize and remedy the fact that a youth who has involvement in both the DSS system and the DJS system, where there is likely childhood trauma, there's likely all the struggles that I've already talked about. Those youth have a double whammy of overwhelming problems to navigate, and the more we can recognize what those struggles are and address within our systems how we may be able to step up and do a better job, the better off everybody in the community will be. So we are all here today to learn, not only in a more nuanced way, why we need to improve our systems on these complicated issues, both as individuals and agencies. I would suggest there's something each one of us can learn about that. But we're also here today to look for guidance on solutions to these issues of disparity of treatment and disproportionate impact on minority youth. Our Washington County Crossover Group has had lots of meetings, we've had lots of discussion, we've been thinking outside the box, but there's a limited amount of knowledge that we bring to the table, and we are looking forward to the expertise that we are going to experience today from our presenters. Before I introduce the presenters, I want to give a really huge shout out to Georgetown University, Macon Stewart, who's running the contacts with our community, with Allegheny, Washington, and Frederick counties, and say that all three counties have really been driven. They've all been working hard to try to better understand some of these challenges and try to address the challenges. Shout out to the Washington County Department of Social Services, Mike Piercy, their fearless leader, who I know had another important commitment today, but Tiffany Rexroad, who is the second in command and absolutely a fearless leader. I've got to say, she is a force of nature in terms of her commitment to change and shake things up from within, which is a little shakeup is what we all need sometimes. I have to say that this whole forum was Tiffany's idea, and she recruited our keynote speaker, Dr. Jessica Pryce, and so I'm very grateful to her for organizing and working on this event and all of her hard work in the community. Shout out to the Department of Juvenile Services with Singy Golden and Derek Geddick, and on the higher up, Betsy Tolentino. I have to say Derek has been tirelessly working on these issues. He's been an organizer of this event. He recruited Ms. Gary, our other speaker, and he is somebody that I always think of as just a force for positive change. He's always being creative and looking outside the box. We have, as another shout out here, Washington County Public Schools, but from my perspective, I should say Tim Morrow, who is the principal of Antietam Academy. He was an organizer of this event. He's worked really hard. He was running around all morning with his tech guy. Not only did he help put this together, but Tim arranged for this event to be live streamed and for there to be a YouTube that will be available. And we will provide you by email, I think, with a link, or maybe we'll have it later. I'm not sure if we'll have it later today, but we'll provide you with a link so that if there are people that were not able to be here and participate today, that they'll have that opportunity as well. And I've got to say that Tim, for those of us who work with child welfare and in the Department of Juvenile Services docket, Tim is an amazing resource in our community. He has always, since I've known him, to be looking for cutting-edge ways to connect with those children that he works with. There's not a child in our, you call it the alternative school, but it's a positive place. It's a positive atmosphere. Tim has worked so much on making sure the kids there feel connected to the staff and to the teachers, connected to him. I don't think there's a kid in that school that does not have his personal cell phone number. And I've heard of, more stories than I can count of kids calling him, in the evening. My mom's in the hospital. I don't know how to get there. And Tim picks them up and takes them, things like that. So just a terrific force in our community. I'd like to thank the Bridge of Life Church and Pastor Dan Pointer, who they're willing to host us, and they're, again, a positive force in this community to look for change for those people who are struggling. And some of our community partners that have been heavily involved in the crossover group: Potomac Case Management, the Boys and Girls Club, Office of Public Defender, the State's Attorney's Office, the Hagerstown City Police, the Washington County Sheriff's Department, Brooklane and other mental health providers, and of course the staff of the Circuit Court for Washington County. We are all motivated as well. We want to be doing a better job than we're doing today. So I have now the honor and the privilege of introducing our two speakers. I'll first talk about our keynote speaker, who is Professor Jessica Pryce. We're delighted to have her. She is a professor at Florida State University, and there she conducts research, she teaches, and she advises on policy. Dr. Pryce has published extensively about child welfare-related topics, including the solutions to the problem of systemic racial disparity, and about anti-poverty practices, and I'm sure many other topics. Dr. Pryce has presented her research in over 30 conferences, both nationally and internationally. She has a personal mission, I understand, to rebuild child welfare systems through strengthening individuals and families instead of families being pulled apart. And one thing I can highly recommend to you, Dr. Pryce did a 2018 TED Talk, and I love TED Talks anyway, but this one was fabulous, and just had some aha moments for me. And as we all know, when you work in this area for a long time, it's kind of harder and harder to find aha moments, but this one had some. So she did a 2018 TED Talk that's entitled, "To Transform Child Welfare, Take Race Out of the Equation." It's had over 1 million views, and Dr. Pryce is a policy advisor to the Florida State Legislature. She's currently serving an appointment to the advisory board of the National Child Welfare Workforce Institute, where she consults and advises on leadership and workforce interventions around the country. So we are privileged and honored to have Dr. Pryce with us here this morning. I'm also going to introduce our speaker from the Department of Juvenile Services, Lisa M. Gary. Ms. Gary is the Director of Equity and Reform for the Maryland Department of Juvenile Services. She guides the agency's efforts to define, assess, nurture, and cultivate institutional fairness and equity in its policies and practices. Prior to coming to DJS, Dr. Gary served as the policy director with the Children for, no, excuse me, I'm going to start that sentence again. She served as a policy director with the Center for Children's Law and Policy in Washington, D.C., where she developed and managed the MacArthur Foundation's Models for Change Disproportionate Minority Contact Action Network. She's also served as a consultant with the Annie E. Casey Foundation to advance the work, opportunities, and outcomes of Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative, and with the W. Hayward Burns Institute on Racial Equity Initiatives in multiple states. So I'd like everybody to give a warm welcome to both of our presenters. Thank you so much. Thank you, ladies. And we both, all of us look forward to learning a lot from both of you here this morning. So thank you very much. Just a really, I'm almost finished here. A quick word on our agenda from almost now, to 10:15 when we take a break. We will hear from Lisa M. Gary from the Department of Juvenile Services. From 10:30 to 11:45, we're going to hear the major presentation of Dr. Jessica Pryce. And then we'll have a very short question and answer period, and then we'll break for lunch. Lunch is on your own, because we don't actually have a budget for this. So we have a lot of fabulous opportunities for lunch in the area. From 1:15 to 4, those of you who are involved in crossover group initiatives, and those of you who are in agency leadership, whether you're private agency or public agency, you're invited to stay for an afternoon discussion which is focused on strategies and innovations in both on the agency level, and as we have individuals who are dealing with youth and families, about how we can improve our outcomes in terms of disparity of treatment. Lunch on your own, even if you're not staying for the afternoon. We have a lot of fabulous downtown restaurants here I can highly recommend. We have 4 right in this block. The Art Gastropub, which is right across the street. It's our newest restaurant. It's fabulous. We have 28 South, Bulls and Bears, Spank Girl Stube. So there are lots of good options. So even if you're not staying for the afternoon, please get a good lunch before you move on with your day. It will make you brighter and cheerier for the rest of your day. So without further ado, I really am grateful to both of these presenters for being here this morning. Thank you for listening to me. And I'm going to turn it over now to Lisa Gary. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Judge Wright. She actually did me a favor and gave me a doctorate, and I did not have to pay a student loan for it or anything. So no, I don't have my doctorate. I don't have that level of discipline. I have a master's level education in public administration. It is so wonderful to be here. I really thank you for the invitation. I don't think there's anything more beautiful than a drive up 70 through Western Maryland, particularly this time of year. So I always look forward to the opportunities to come up here because I know I'm going to get a beautiful drive. So with that being said, Singy and Derek, thank you for thinking of me in terms of this presentation and being able to contribute and sow some pretty good seeds, what I consider to be good seeds here. I saw Singleton this morning, and she said, "Thanks for coming up." And I said, "Well, yeah, thanks to me afterwards. Let's see how it goes." So with no further ado, if you would notice from the screen behind me, the title of my presentation is Intentional Leadership, Operationalizing Race Equity in Public Systems. We use the word intentional because it says a little bit more about the work around race equity. It's more than just knowing the data trends. It's more than just having that moment where you're concerned about the disparate treatment of children and youth and families of color. It's more than just even recognizing that in the system, outcomes for children and families of color look a little different than they do for others, for white youth in particular. So for us, all of the work around race equity must be intentional. So a lot of my theme this morning, you're going to hear about being intentional. DJS is one of very few agencies in the country who actually has an Office of Equity, where the focus is specifically on racial and ethnic equity, as well as even some gender equity, as well as LGBTQIA equity. And so all of that work is designed to be an intentional work. And so we want to start out by defining some things. So much of our work around race equity and so much of the dialogue about race equity is shut down because we do not know as a country how to talk about race. We don't know how to have discussions about race, to be able to hear other ideas, even be able to understand historically and socially the construct of race. And because we're not willing to take the time to have those definitions and to say the same thing to each other and understand the commonality of the language that we use, we typically will break down and not have a conversation about race. How many people in here would rather talk about anything other than race? I'm the only one. Come on now. I'm going to ask that question at the end. But the truth of the matter is the conversations about race, but particularly about racism, is an uncomfortable conversation. So I want to start by defining just a few things. When we define racial and ethnic equity, it is simply a reality in which a person is no more or no less likely to experience society's benefits or burdens due to one's race or ethnicity. Most times people confuse equality and equity, and they're two different things. We're going to cover some of that. But the problem that we have in public systems, not just in the juvenile justice system, not just in child welfare system, not just in the school system, even in behavioral and mental health systems, the issues that we have as a system, as a public system, several hurdles that we have to overcome. First is we tend to implement reform strategies without being intentional about race. We try to reform our way to equity. We try to do new policies and practices without being intentional about what is the impact, what is the outcome for youth and families of color. The second thing we do, we avoid having an honest dialogue about institutional and structural racism. And I can tell you up front, you cannot address issues of equity unless you acknowledge and begin to do the work to dismantle structural racism. We're going to talk a little bit about what that is today. And also, we allow individuals to become the sole champions of race equity matters. For example, everyone in this room, I'm assuming you're here out of your interest also, as well as your advocacy for this issue. In your organization, in your office, in your agency, you may in fact be the race equity advocate. But guess what? The work to achieve equity is not solely on your shoulders, nor should it be. It's a shared work across systems and across persons. Not just the advocates, but also some allies for the issue. And then we work too often in the treetop issues, and those are the things that we can easily see. So, for example, in Department of Juvenile Services, we see overrepresentation of children of color from the front door, i.e. intake, all the way through to the very deep end, aftercare and reentry, as well as kids waived to the adult system. That's just what we see. But do we take the time to peel back the layers to understand why we're seeing the problem that we're seeing? Are we actually doing some of the root work, or as my grandmother would call it, the roots? We're not working in the roots of a thing. We continue to work on treetops, trying to prune what we're seeing and change what we're seeing without addressing and resolving the causes of what we're seeing. That is the work of equity, and that is not an overnight work. I don't even know if it's something that I will realize fully, even for Department of Juvenile Services, upon leaving the agency. I am just creating a foundation and a blueprint, and someone else will come behind me and add to it, and it goes on and on. It's the same thing for all of our agencies if we're going to do this work authentically and for results. Then also there's another hurdle for public systems is that we're time limited. So much of the work around race equity and reform is always tied to grants, which have a lifespan, and when it's over, when a grant is over, the work typically ends. Then it's term limited. Sometimes you have the work around race equity and reform that is tied to specific leaders. Here you have Judge Wright, who is a strong champion for the issue of equity and the disparate treatment and disproportionate representation of kids across the systems for your crossover initiative. But she's one person. And as her life will go on, just like everyone else's, to something else, what will happen with the work? Again, you just can't have the work on the shoulders of one particular individual or leader, because that means that the work would not have any longevity. And then also, another hurdle for public systems that we're data limited and that we will track the trends and not causes. For example, again, DJS using that as an example because that's my lens. Being able to understand the number of kids of color at the point of intake or at the point of commitment to DJS, we can track those trends. But are we getting behind the number to track the causes of the trends? What is leading them to enter the system? What is leading them to penetrate or go further into the system? So those are just some of the hurdles that we have as a public system. And one of the things that's more common for us that is more the work, it requires a shift in values. Race equity is a value shift, not just a policy or legislative change. We can change every policy in our office or our organizations to speak to race equity. But if the culture of your organization and your community does not change, it doesn't mean anything. It has no longevity. It's not even you can't even implement it. And then you can think about different things that you've tried to implement, different changes. You always have had to work on the organizational or staff culture. And so much of the equity work is drawn from our culture as organizations, our cultures as a people, our cultures as a community of folks, our culture as a country. Just even understanding race and racism in the context of where we were and where we are today. That is a critical part of the work, and it's the most difficult and the most nuanced. So why are racial disparity problems so pervasive? One of the things that I'm sorry that I'm used to being in a smaller room, so I do apologize for the size of the screen and some of the words on the screen, but I'm going to try to do my best to kind of give you some of the insights here. The problems with race equity is so pervasive because most of our work takes place where, again, on the treetops. Those are the things that we can see. Those things that we can see, such as disproportionate incarceration, lengthier supervision, or commitment terms, a pathway to the adult system, those are the things that we can touch and see. If you think about your system, how many of you are from the mental child welfare system? Okay. How many from juvenile justice? Okay. How about education? Okay. Anyone here just from community? Okay. So when you think about your individual organizations, you can think about some of the things where you see clear, disparate treatment or disproportionate representation for children and families of color at different parts of your system decision making. You can understand and see those things. But think about the work going deeper. Think about the work at the roots. Too many of our efforts are focused on the effects of our disparities, and too little of it focuses on root causes. Root causes of inequities, structural inequities, implicit bias, differential policing, external pipelines, overlap of race and class effects, again, the intersectionality between race and class, unintended consequences of policies. You can have really good policy that has a disparate impact or holds what we call collateral consequences for youth and families of color. So much of our work, we focus a lot on those yellow boxes because those are policy and practice changes. But it's in the blue work, the blue boxes. Those are the things that require you to make some real changes that affect culture and also show your values. What are your values as an organization, as an agency, as a system, as a community? What are your values as it relates to race equity, diversity, and inclusion? So why race equity? Acknowledging the need and planning outcomes for youth of color in Washington County. When I spoke to Derek and Tiffany, and we talked about some of the challenges here, some of the work that has to take place here in Washington County, the question came up as to, or the comment was, whether or not people really believed that there was a racially disparate system for youth and families of color in both juvenile justice, child welfare, and education here in Washington County. How many of you believe that there is some work to do around race equity here in Washington County? Okay. And so we see here, total youth ages 11 to 17. This comes from our data resource guide from the Department of Juvenile Services. This is based on the most recent census. That will be updated soon. But total youth ages 11 to 17, 81.4% are white youth, 18.6% are youth of color combined. Youth of color combined is what we have as African American youth, Hispanic youth or Latino youth, as well as any other youth. The problem that we have in the state of Maryland, which we're working to do for the first time, we're trying to count Hispanic youth correctly. Because right now, they're not being counted correctly. When they come into our offices at the point of intake, we usually take that information from police. How do you think police are identifying Hispanic or Latino children? They're looking at them. Some police officers, they do actually try to access the information, but most of them look at it. We have a large number of biracial kids being identified right now as Hispanic or Latino. So part of your first task is making sure that you have the capacity to collect data, accurate ethnicity data in the first place. So we combine, for our purposes of understanding the disparate impact of system decision making on youth and families of color, we combine all those populations, including also a small growing number of Asian youth in that population in the state of Maryland. I don't know if that's the same in Washington County. So total youth, 18.6% are children of color, 81.4% are white youth. At the point of intake, juvenile complaints, 37.1% are, white youth. 62.9% are youth of color. So they're more than 3 times overrepresented at the point of intake. At the point of security detention, 68.8% are all youth of color. Again, more than 3 times overrepresented at that particular decision point. And at the point of DJS commitment, 67.7% are youth of color. That's, again, more than 3 times overrepresented. So you see from here that from the point of intake all the way through to some of your deeper decision points, and one including security detention, the other including DJS commitment, i.e. commitment to state custody, is where you see the disproportionality cemented. And so it's not enough just to say if we stop them from coming in or reduce the numbers at the point of intake or at the point of arrest, we'll solve the problem, because the truth of the matter is you still have policy and decision making that may drive even the lowest risk kids into the system. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to try to get to some of that today in terms of how do we make that assessment. But that's your data. So we can agree that there are racial disparities and how children and families of color, at least from Department of Juvenile Services perspective, how they experience and encounter our system. So in understanding equality versus equity, there's this notion that if we treated all the kids the same way, we could resolve the problem. So sameness promotes fairness and justice by giving everyone the same thing. But it only works if everyone starts from the same place. Fairness, on the other hand, that is the work of equity. It gives people access to the same opportunities, i.e., they don't have an opportunity to do some things. There are some things that children and families of color are behind the 8 ball, so to speak, on. And so part of our equity work is really about fairness, creating opportunities for them, and increasing the opportunities, and also ensuring that their outcomes are to thrive and to do well are achieved. So our differences in history can create structural barriers to participation. So there are structural barriers to those opportunities, which we're going to start unfolding. But again, equality is sameness. Equity is fairness. There are some things that kids get the same. They have access to public education. They all have access to public education. They have a right to be educated. When they come to us, one of the things I talk about in terms of our equality is that all of our kids receive the same thing. They receive the same number of meals. They receive the same living conditions. And so much of what we do is not do away with one in order to achieve the other. You must have both equality and equity, but to do the work of race equity, you have to understand it is a different work. It's less about what they get and more about what we see that they need. You understand the difference? And so one of the things that we do to operationalize equity in Department of Juvenile Services, we have what we call DJS Race Equity Framework. And it has two tenets. One, to promote and advance outcomes that end racialized outcomes. A racialized outcome is something that can be predicted by race. For example, a police incident in 2019 or police contact can be seen as a racialized incident. When we are promoting and advancing outcomes that end racialized outcomes, we must begin to first and foremost acknowledge where we have a problem. Then we must identify, correct, and eliminate systemic causes of race inequity. When we are identifying, correcting, and eliminating systemic causes of inequity, that is the work where we begin to question ourselves. So it's no longer a question about what the kids do to come to our attention. What happened in the family for them to get into the child welfare system? What did the kid do in the community or in school to get arrested? Those aren't the questions that we ask ourselves when we're trying to eliminate systemic causes of race equity. A systemic cause of inequity, for example, in schools and communities of color, what is the presence of policing in those communities? What is the presence of policing in the school community? And so it's a more intentional look at what happens systemically by people who make decisions as opposed to what is the behavior or actions of the target, i.e. the client. Okay? So when we're becoming intentional about race equity, being intentional involves strategic and routine examination and dismantling of system policies. Examination and dismantling of system policies, practices, programs that create or perpetuate racial and ethnic disparities. Being intentional means that I am willing to examine myself. I am willing to examine my agency. I am willing to examine our policies. I am willing to examine legislative language or the language of our statutes. When I am intentional, I'm also committed to dismantling barriers. And if I'm going to dismantle a barrier, I have to acknowledge it as a barrier. And so one of the things that we like to do to kind of go through what those barriers are. Again, so much of our conversation about race equity is about the authenticity of the dialogue, the transparency of the dialogue, but also the intention of the dialogue. And so the levels of racism and change, and the reason why we have 4 levels of racism and change is that we have, just as we got into the problem, it's the same way we're going to get out of the problem. For example, first level, personal. Those are our values, our beliefs, our feelings, our attitudes, and, excuse me, our opinions. I don't have my reading glasses. Y'all got to bear with me. So, levels of racism, personal, values, beliefs, feelings, attitudes, and opinions. That's the first level. I can have a bias. I can have a belief. I can have a view of a particular racial or ethnic group. And I may have an opinion that may be informed by my lens. It's my only thing I have that is informing me about that other group is my lens and my interaction, or what I've learned or what I've heard. Okay? So much of what we understand about race is a part of what we call a social construct. Race is socially constructed. To prove the point, just yell it out. How many of you, tell me what you know about Alaska? Anyone? It's cold. What else? Say it again. Okay, glaciers. What else? A lot of what? Too many men. Okay. All right. Oh, wow. Then I'm not going to Alaska. But, so, for those of you who offer the answer, how many of you have actually been to Alaska? One. You had a lot of answers, or a couple. But it's what we understand and know about Alaska is constructed socially by what we heard, what we read, what we saw, what someone else experienced, so we live vicariously to inform us of our opinions about Alaska. So it's a certain perspective. There are multiple perspectives on a thing, but not all your perspectives are drawn from your own experience. So much of it is from social construction. What you hear, what you learn, what you experience, or through the experiences of others. So, in understanding your personal level of racism, understanding that some of it is drawn by what your social construct has been. The second level is interpersonal. That is your behavior, treatment, relationships, and communications. So much of what we learn and experience in our personal values and attitudes, they find comfort and companionship socially. And so if I have certain perspectives and attitudes about a particular racial or ethnic group, then I may find my interpersonal interactions may be governed more or driven more towards persons who have the same opinion as I have. So interpersonally, my opinions, my behaviors, and my treatment, my relationship, and my communications become a part of how I begin to express what I believe personally. But then I find a home for it culturally, because then I am surrounded by persons who share my worldview or share my norms, and then we share stories, and then we have our shared values and unwritten rules, and then media, then public opinion. All these things can serve to affirm and confirm what I believe when I stay in my own bubble. And then it shifts to institutional, which is the fourth layer, which is policies, practices, rules, procedures, and systems. So I'm going to give you an example. If I have a bias, I'm just fictional. If I have a bias against a particular racial or ethnic group, let's say I have a bias against a group and I figure they can't drive. It just may be my bias. It may be my experience. It may be driven by something I've heard, something I've learned or experienced or learned to believe for myself. Whatever it is, in terms of it being socially constructed, it is my belief if I feel like this particular group cannot drive. Then I began to express it interpersonally. I began to show my displeasure with this group. Again, this is just fictional, but I want to show you how this works. So interpersonally, I become very adamant and very expressive in my frustration with this group. On the road, that I may encounter someone from this group, I might actually have a little road rage. I may be indignant. I may not want to be driving next to them. I might have all kinds of interpersonal or behaviors or treatments or ways that I deal with this group because of my personal bias, my prejudice, okay? And then culturally, that might get reaffirmed when I go among my friends or among my family, and I make the comment, I don't think this group can drive, and someone said, girl, me neither, because so-and-so happened to me. And so then I'm being affirmed, I'm being confirmed, and then there may be something on the news that confirms this more accidents by this particular racial ethnic group than any other group. Culturally, I'm being confirmed. My behavior, my attitude is being affirmed. It is given license to operate. When it becomes institutional, if I am the person who determines who gets their licensing and how and what all they must do, whether I can influence that decision in any kind of way or make the decision directly because I'm director of MVA, I might make some changes to policy to reflect my values, my beliefs, and my attitudes, all of which have been upheld by my cultural view and affiliation. That's how you get to institutional policies and practice. And then I have an aha moment that I had a racist perspective and opinion about a group. And from that, I'm having an aha moment where I'm making my change and I'm repenting. I'm in the church, I'm repenting about that belief and that attitude. But guess what? It's too late, because guess what's already embedded in policy? My bias. So much of what we're doing around race equity, you must be able to see change in all four levels. You just can't do one. The problem with most initiatives, policy initiatives, where do you think we focus most of our time? Institutional. We try to address institutional policies, practices, laws, rules, and procedures in the system without acknowledging and addressing the personal, interpersonal, and cultural barriers to race equity. So much of the work is trying to get to those first 3 levels because that's what informed your 4th level in the first place. Does that make sense to you? So if you're going to do the work of equity, you must be able to see it across the 4 levels. What is really driving our commitment to a policy that has a disparate impact on children and families of color? What personal biases, behaviors, attitudes, and perceptions are inherent in that decision making? And how do we then begin to remove that from our policy, but also address the personal, interpersonal, and cultural lens that fed it in the first place? So much of that is the work, but that is the most complicated and nuanced thing to do. Because when you start talking about personal, interpersonal biases, what do we start calling it? It makes us feel comfortable. Implicit. Not all bias is implicit. Most bias is just that. It's bias. It is racism, it's prejudice, it's discrimination, it's stereotype. Because race is socially constructed, and it requires us to do the grown-up work to call a thing a thing. And I believe in that as a part of the race equity community professionals in America. We must call a thing and get to all these different levels of not only racism, but the change. So we have a framework in DJS, and I'm going to spend a little time talking about our 5 levels of our DJS race equity framework. 5 things that we do. 5 things that must be a part of your pie, no matter which, I don't care if you're DJS, you're the school system, you're child welfare. 5 things I believe firmly should be part of your process, your procedure. Language. How do we communicate about race and ethnicity? What's our language? What's our shared language? Are we defining race the same way? Are we being implicit about, or explicit rather, are we being explicit about the isms? Are we bold and confident? Do we even have a glossary of terms that we use? The second is, what's our capacity? How do we work with greater understanding of equity problems? And so if we know the language of equity, then can we actually hold ourselves accountable to having and building capacity of our staff to address equity in ways that are authentic? Not just coming in the room looking at data every other month or every quarter. The data is not going to change. What you do with the information is what changes the data. The data is not going to change. What you do with it changes the outcomes of the data. Okay? So what's our capacity to change the data trend? Then we look at it with an equity lens, which is what is the impact of our policy, decision making on youth of color? That's the intention, not what is the outcome for all our kids. What is the explicit impact on children and families of color? So you made a policy change, you made a practice change. It's not enough just to say, okay, let's see if this works. Does this work for youth and families of color? And if not, why doesn't it work? It's an intentional lens. We're going to cover some of the lens shortly. Then application. Now that we have a shared language and we have capacity and we have an equity lens, what do we do with it? What do we do as a result? How do we operationalize equity? Part of operationalized equity is making sure that I, as Director of Equity and Reform, am not the only person in DJS who not only has a lens, but also has a commitment to solutions. That means I have created more champions, that we have worked to create more champions, we have more allies, and we are doing things as a matter of practice as opposed to one individual being the person saying, I got you, I got the spotlight, here I am with the equity flashlight. Not enough. It has to be an organizational commitment to be able to use a lens so that everything you do, you're processing it through what is the impact on children and families of color. How do we advance opportunities for children and families of color? How do we go about mitigating the burden of policy on practice for children and families of color? How do we go about eliminating policies and practices that have a clearly measurable disparate impact on children and families of color? That is the work. And then what are our results? What does racial equity look like? What does that look like for you here in Washington County? for crossover. Have you all had the conversation that as a system, an equitable system, mental health or child welfare or juvenile service, juvenile justice looks like this? Because that is the conversation that you have to have before you, because in order to see a thing, you had to be able to say what your thing is. It's usually not defined. Most race equity groups come together, they do not know what their it is. They just know they have a problem. And you can acknowledge your problem, but you have to have a goal as well. Is it to reduce the number of children and families of color who are co-committed between child welfare and juvenile services? If that's the goal, that's one of your goals. Take it further. Which part of the community? Where are they more prevalent? Is it a particular age group? You have to have that level of intention and focus. So when we look at our language, we create and share a common language to discuss and examine barriers to race equity. A few words, just a few words in our glossary. Our glossary is what my staff are here. I'm sorry I didn't acknowledge them at first. Lisa Renee and Octavia Pratt, the two of my staff, they tolerate me. So give them a hand, please. So how many pages is our glossary now? About 3 or 4? Front, back, 3 or 4, yeah. So we have a common language that we use, and when we start going back and forth about what it is or what the terms are, we go back to say, what is our shared language? How do we define race? How do we define racism? So we define race, we have a actual definition as any real or presumed physical or biological characteristics such as skin color, hair texture, as well as shared lineage. We're clear when we're defining race as well as ethnicity. Then what is ethnicity? Real or presumed cultural characteristics such as language, religion, tradition, and cultural practices. Understanding that there's a difference between the two. So we're very explicit in defining that. We will also have a working definition of race, which is socially constructed meaning to the first thing. Socially constructed meaning that's attached to physical attributes such as skin color, hair texture, bone structure, etc. So whenever we are talking about race, we're talking from our working definition of race, of understanding race as socially constructed. For capacity, we have 3 levels of training for our staff to build staff capacity to engage not only in the planning and implementation of racially equitable, culturally competent strategies, but at the end of the day, are our staff, DJS staff, are they proficient in cultural competence? And that's more than just having someone who knows command Spanish. But are we culturally proficient as an agency? So we have several layers of training. We do the language of equity, the first level. You cannot have a conversation about race equity until you have a common shared language. Then we do the lens of equity. How do we go about teaching our staff how to look at policy and practice through a race ethnicity lens? And the third is leadership for equity, because at the end of the day, if you're going to operationalize equity, you have to have someone other than your director of equity or your consultant like Dr. Pryce coming in. You have to have a number of people who are committed to leading for equity across every single region. Derek is one of our, and Singy, they're 2 of our equity champions and allies. So I ask you, as you go back and you start thinking about your agency, who are your allies? Who are your advocates? Who are your champions for equity? So leadership for equity is a training of trainers for us to create persons who become, God help us, mini-me's. And then an equity lens. Again, we use our lens to guide assessment and development of agency policy and practice. And when we do that, part of guiding it is we vet policy and practice. So every policy that we have, every policy revision crosses my desk and I sign off or I don't sign off. And the question becomes, are we looking at this in terms of what is the impact on children and families of color? So to vet is to explicitly consider a range of factors with regard to race and ethnicity. For example, we had a policy recently that dealt with, I think it's home visitation, and persons in a home, anyone in the home who has ever, the way it was written, anyone who has ever had criminal contact in the home. Like that child was excluded from being able to have that home visit. That's racially disparate given what we understand about the construct and the context of many communities of color. And the fact that you have a growing number of non-traditional family structures in communities of color, i.e. multiple persons in the home who may be first or second generation, not your immediate family. So being able to have that lens to say, what is this impact? We had to make that language shift. Okay? And so I'm getting the 10-minute sign now. I got 10 minutes? Huh? 15? Oh, okay. Okay. So again, having an equity lens vetting policy and practicing programming to determine explicit impact, but also to cultivate a working lens. So it's not enough just for me to vet the policy, but before we even set policy or establish policy, how many of you are here are policy makers? Which means you're the boss. How about you're second from the boss? Somewhere third from the boss? How many of you implement policy? You make some decision for somebody. Okay. I know I'm in the right room. So if you make some decision for children and families, you have to be able to work a lens into what you do. You have to be able to think about how you're implementing something and being accountable to that for children and families of color. Excuse me. And so basically what our lens does, this is very small, but I'm going to read it to you. What is the desired end? What are we hoping to achieve or change with this proposed policy or this proposed direction? Most policy comes up in public systems because we're trying to cover up something. I shouldn't say it like that. I forgot we're on YouTube. We're usually trying to cross our T's and dot our I's. In the field, they call it CYA. We got a lot of policy because we're trying to cover ourselves and not be accountable or liable to an extent where we're seen as being negligent. A lot of policy comes up that way. Sometimes practice or policy directives come up in terms of this is how we need you to dot every I and cross every T. And that's the truth because laws govern most of our decision making. So when we have a policy, it's our way of saying what are we holding ourselves accountable to? So if we're holding ourselves accountable to a thing, most times I ask, what's the purpose of this policy? And we usually get down to the fact that it covers us more so than serves kids or families. And I understand I'm part of a bureaucratic agency or whatever, and you have to have policy, but the question becomes, then where are our opportunities to take this to another level where we can actually do something good for children and families of color? So the next thing is, who specifically is or will be affected? So as we're looking at our policy, like similar to the one I gave you about home visitation, who's looking at the policy, who's affected, we know the majority of kids coming out of coming home from incarceration are children of color. We know this because your data here in Washington County says so. At least 68% are children of color. So that's who's affected. Again, being explicit about this is who it affects. And then secondly, inclusion of affected communities. How have we gained the voice or concerns of the groups most affected? How many of you set policy because you actually have had a focus group or an advisory group of parents? Nobody. How about an advisory group of youth? What are some of the barriers to doing that? Should there be any? If we are going to create opportunities and be equitable, again, giving people what they need to survive and thrive, what is our relationship with engaging them and what we do and how we do it? And then holding them accountable to it. So you can't tell me I'm a horrible agency if you were at the table making decisions with me. So it wasn't enough that I'm the case manager and I wrote the treatment plan and you signed off on it. I need to know that you have skin in the game, which means I need you committed to it as well. That's part of inclusion. Most agencies, most public systems, we do not work very well with our clients. But that is becoming a detriment to us in terms of achieving equity because that is where you get the change. You get the persons who are committed to the changes that you want to see. And then where are our opportunities for equity? So, okay, we got this policy. It may not be the best thing. I don't understand the need for it, but since we're going to have policy because we dotting every I and crossing every T because what we do as agencies, then where are our work opportunities? How can we use this to advance explicit benefits for children and families of color? And how can we use this policy to eliminate or minimize the burdens for children and families of color? So if you would notice with this lens, it requires you to do more than just write a policy and tell your staff to implement it and sign off. It requires you to be what? Intentional about race and ethnicity and the impact of decision-making by race and ethnicity. And then the 5, what are our results? How will we measure our results? Most times, don't tell me we're doing equity if you can't give me anything that's measurable. If you can't tell me any population of kids who will be affected positively. If we're doing something different, Derek, at intake, we know that we are affecting kids who are at the front end of the system or with new arrests. May have system involvement, but they have new arrests. So again, being very specific about the population. And then again, application inclusion. I want to talk a little bit about the monitoring. Define equity results up front, and again, what's your it? And choose something that's doable. You're not going to solve racism. I couldn't stand up here and earn enough money to tell you how to solve racism. I can tell you what it looks like and how it shows up, personally, interpersonally, culturally, and institutionally. But no agency has a mandate or resource enough to solve that problem. We begin to set the tone and the blueprint for it and what we do with the population or the kids who come after us and what we teach our kids helps to, every generation does something more progressively better than the other. But choose your small, doable actions. As you're doing, come back this afternoon, what are some of the things that you can do around race equity? That you can do, it can be implemented, and you can measure it. And then routinely track related equity indicators. In order to know our progress, we have to know where we started versus where we're going. So that's it for me. And I usually have questions and answers, but I think we're going to go to our next presenter and do questions and answers afterwards. Is that right, Doctor? Okay. Any questions or answers, or anybody want to offer me some advice? No questions? None. Okay. I'll be around for a minute. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a fabulous presentation. I feel like I have a much better understanding of maybe some of the beginnings of what we can do. So everybody can take a roughly, 10-minute break? 15-minute break? We're going to reconvene here. Please be back in here at 10:30 so that we can get started on time. So thank you.
So what I'm going to talk about today, Judge Wright gave us some intel before we came, and she talked about people that were coming, were going to be interested in solutions and maybe what you could do at your agency. So although that TED Talk was about blind removals, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, the rest of my presentation is going to be on what other areas of the country and what they're doing, and I hope that it stimulates some thought within you and your team. So before I get started, I talked to a gentleman, I guess about 2 weeks ago, and he's a consultant and he works with leaders who do public speaking, and he said, it's important when you get up in front of a group to share something about yourself because they connect with you as a speaker, as a person. So I decided to share something with you before I get started. I just got a puppy. And I have wanted a puppy for about 10 years. Bear with me, I don't use a Mac anymore, so I don't know what I'm doing. Okay. All right, I keep touching the screen. I think it's a touch screen. So this is Rocky, and I finally got a puppy. And for the last decade, I've wanted a puppy, and I've talked to family and friends, and they've said, you can't have a puppy, you travel all the time. And I do travel 50 to 65% of the time. But then I talked to a friend who travels more than me, and she has a dog. So I said, I want to talk to you, carve out some time, and let's chat. And we talked about adaptability. And that's the word I want you to think about throughout my presentation and when it comes back to the work that you do. So she said, Jessica, you can get a dog and you can adapt. So I'm telling you, for 10 years, I said it's impossible for me to have a dog. But I adapted. I've only had him for a week, but I'm going to keep at it. Does anyone here have a pet, a dog? Okay, so tap me afterwards. I need your advice. If you have any words of wisdom. So I'll look forward to chatting with you about this and child welfare, for sure. All right. Okay. And okay, that's not what I need. PowerPoint. Okay. And all right, is it up there? All right. So addressing racial disparity and disproportionality in child welfare. I usually just tell people if you have questions, shoot your hand up, but I think we're going to do that afterwards. But if anything's pressing, just let me know. So we're going to start with what's being done. So if you go around the country and ask people what are they doing to combat racial equity and disparity, a lot of them may say prevention. So I'm going to talk about CAPTA, and I will not make this a policy lecture, which my students back in Tallahassee would appreciate, but I will talk about CAPTA because in all the specifications of CAPTA, they did have a funding stream to really bolster prevention and assessments. Okay? So there was a mindset of if we prevent all kids from coming into care, that's going to work. That's going to help with racial equity. Again, emphasis on the word all. So they said this is prevent all kids coming into care, and that will fix this. But if you really think about it, that's not necessarily true. You have to think about prevention from primary to secondary to tertiary. Should we apply things for everyone, or should we look at a targeted group that's more vulnerable? Okay? So prevention is a very good idea, but I don't know if everyone approaches it in the most effective way. But that was done as far as a federal legislation. Yeah. Also in CAPTA was risk assessments. Okay? There was this push that if we have essentially didactic, objective, structured risk assessment tools, your opinions won't even be a part of it. Your subjectivity won't be there. Okay? I think it's a great idea, and I understand where they came from. But there was some research done on risk assessments, and they found that even when they had comparable families, whether it's a Hispanic family, a black family, a Caucasian family, when they looked at comparable histories, comparable maltreatments, across the risk assessments, black families were still rated higher risk. So although risk assessments was a really good idea, research is showing that it's not making a big difference when it comes to disparity. Let's look at this. There was also research done where they actually looked at disproportionality, thinking this county has initiated a robust risk assessment. Let's look at if it impacted their disproportionality. But these researchers found that there was no difference in counties that used a rigorous risk assessment and their disproportionality. Okay? So this slide is really to show you what this overarching, what's being done at the federal policy level was when it comes to racial equity. But now I want to talk about what communities are doing, because as you can see, these may not have, panned out the way the people that push CAPTA might have imagined, because communities are different and we have to adapt. And everything can't go through bill to law. Some things have to happen at the agency level. So I want to talk about Franklin County, and it is my hope that some of the counties and the communities I'm going to talk about, you've already heard about. If not, that's good too, but hopefully some of the things that are happening is getting out there. Now, some of the things that are going on around the country, I don't think it will seem counterintuitive to you. It'll seem intuitive, but I think when counties are formalizing it and really being methodical about it, that's when they're seeing results. So in 2005 in Franklin County, they had 3,000 African American children on their caseloads. 5 years later, they had cut that number in half, and they did it in a very systematic, thoughtful way. Okay? So these are some of the things that they did. So number one, they identified community needs. They deployed a team of researchers to go out and talk to community members about what are their needs and what are the challenges that they're facing, particularly communities of color. One major factor that they found, and I know that it's comparable to what's happening in Florida, I don't know about here, but it might be, access to services. The services that they need, they didn't have access to it. It wasn't in certain communities. And sometimes the actual services that were there were not high quality, and it wasn't comprehensive. It wasn't culturally sensitive. Okay? Those are the things that Franklin County found. Then they actively partnered with community resource agencies. They called childcare, education to the table, and they had meetings and community forums, a lot like this one. They said, let's get together and think about prevention and think about resources for the families in our community. Then they did something that might not be as common, but they engaged to examine bias at decision-making points. They mapped out cases in their meetings, and they looked at every point where a decision was made and why. And they talked through it. Was that necessary? Was it fair? What was considered? What wasn't considered? What should we have done? What didn't we do? Right? That's what they did as a team. And then they addressed that bias at the organizational level. And it reminds me of what Ms. Gary said. It's not one person's duty. And one thing the Franklin County leadership said is, we never wanted anyone to feel like it was one ethnicity's job to fix this, or it was one person's job to fix this. At an organizational level, this is a priority. That's how they shifted it, and that's how they got buy-in. And as you can see, it made a difference in their numbers. So I'm gonna go to another county, several other counties, and I want you to think about what they're doing and how they compare to each other. But there are nuances in what people are doing, and I want you to take note of that, especially around the community needs assessment and identification, because that's kind of throughout each county. So Nassau County, the one I just talked about in the TED Talk. And this is the only county that I myself researched and evaluated and collected data. Everyone else, they are undergoing research right now and tracking data. But this county, I was able to go in and evaluate their program. So in 2011, 55% of Black children were being removed from their families. 5 years later, 27% of Black children were being removed from their families. So it was a significant decrease. Right? So it was my job to go in and figure out why. So this is where, of course, the blind removal is the big thing. This is what everybody's talking about in Nassau County and in other areas of the country. But there were steps that they took to get to that point. So they started with training. And I know some people roll their eyes at training, like not another implicit bias training, but they did some intense training around racial equity and then bridges out of poverty. So when I talked to the workforce about the most salient and effective trainings, these were the two that came up. They had several trainings, but they said the racial equity training and the bridges out of poverty, understanding what poverty really means and understanding the difficulties that it takes to live, let alone parent, when you have limited resources. So they decided to do some intense training with their workforce. And when I say workforce, I mean from frontline all the way through their commissioners sat through these trainings because they were getting them ready to have a culture shift toward blind removals. So the next thing was blind removal. So keep in mind, I often tell people this, in Nassau County, they already had removal meetings, and not everyone does this. So meeting Tiffany has been a joy. I met Tiffany, I guess, almost a year ago. And they have a mechanism, within her organization that kind of slows the process down. It reminds me of this. So they have a removal meeting in Nassau County where they sit down in a room and talk about the case and decide if a child should be removed. But after this, the intensity of the training of racial equity and before the training, there was tracking of their data and their poor outcomes as it relates to brown and Black kids. they decided to blind the removal meetings. So a lot of people around the country asked me, well, we want to do blind removals, how do we do it? And it can be done, but I want to always say that in Nassau County, they already had a structure, and they just blinded that structure. So as it talked about in the TED Talk, they come into this room and do their normal removal meetings, but now they blind out the content. Do we have any caseworkers in here? Okay. So sometimes it's hard to imagine, debriefing a case or talking to someone and not mentioning race, not mentioning neighborhood, not mentioning language barriers, not mentioning gender, things like that. But that's what they did. They had to really train themselves. The caseworker and their supervisor were the only two people in the removal meeting that knew all these demographics. So they discussed it, and then there was a decision made in that meeting. Another thing they did is they focused on workforce diversity. Again, I know some people will shudder at this, like, what do they mean by diversity? But they wanted their organization to match the demographics of the community. That sounds impossible in some areas of the country, I know, but they worked really hard at that. They're also on Long Island, so maybe that was a little bit, of course, a different geographic area. And they also made pamphlets and community resource guides in multiple languages. So they wanted to incorporate and infuse a feeling of, we see that you might speak a different language, but you can still have this pamphlet and understand it. And of course, as some people do, they have translators and people like that, okay, to help with the engagement. Yes, sir? In Long Island, it is representative of Long Island in general. Does that answer? Okay, yes. All right, thank you for clarifying that. And community prevention partners, that was also a big part of Nassau County and their work towards this. And again, remember the comparison to Franklin County. I think this is gonna be across all boards. You have to partner with the community, but how you do it, I think, is key. So when it came to Nassau County, they really wanted to bolster up their resources. So I heard from them in my research that they didn't just send people to resource areas. They didn't just say, go do this, go do that. They had contacts with people over there. They said, so-and-so's on the way. They talked to the person in front of them about what the organization and the resource center would be providing and why, things like that. A little bit more intentional, as Ms. Gary said earlier. So these are some quotes that you've already heard on the TED Talk, which were really, really eye-opening. And they told me during my research that they don't know if the caseworkers or the teams would have been so open and transparent had it not been for that front legwork with the training and the racial equity work. But they were very forthcoming about their own personal thoughts and perceptions about families and about their work and how this entire, culture change has really impacted that. Okay, I'm moving on to another county, but again, we can always come back to asking more specific questions. My next county is Broward County, Florida. So this is my state. And in Broward County, again, I work for an institute at Florida State, and the Community Participatory Action Research Team actually applied for a grant through my institute, and I granted it. And they're co-researching the disparities in Broward County with participants and system partners. Now in Broward County, the Black children that were removed from their families was almost 60%, but their actual population was only a third of the county. So they were very stunned by this and said, we must do something. So they designed a study that would incorporate parents that have lost their children, parents that are actively trying to get their children back, system partners, community members, children that are in both systems, crossover youth, children that have aged out of care, and all of those people are working to co-create a race equity culture in Broward County right now, with the goal at the end of having a shift in policy that was informed by everyone on that task force. So it is a really, really neat project. It is underway. It started in July. And we're looking forward to continuing to report out what they find. So the next bullet is color consciousness. This is actually Palm Beach County, I believe, but it's South Florida. And I am considered someone who really is pushing the blind removal agenda. Did a TED Talk on it, did the research on it, I'm pushing it out. But this past year, I hosted a symposium in Florida, a racial equity symposium. And I invited a speaker who doesn't believe in blind processes at all. And because I'm the type of person that believes in hearing all types of perspectives, you don't have to drink my Kool-Aid. You can come with your own thoughts and let us know what's working for you. So this gentleman came to the symposium, and he talked about color consciousness, taking the blinders off, okay? And he frames that in a way of looking at family engagement. So he started his keynote by saying, blind removal processes are the antithesis of race equity. And everyone kind of looked over at me to see if there was smoke coming out of my head, but it wasn't. I was happy to hear what he had to say, because again, if this is working for your county, that's what we want, effectiveness, and it is working. In this county in Florida, they train their team to be really, really engaged in families, especially families of color. So he brought his entire team to the symposium, and these were supervisors, child protective investigators, and case managers. And they said, we take the blinders off. We sit down with families and we tell them, there's a disparity in our system. There's disproportionality. We don't want that to happen to you. Let's talk. Let's figure this out together. So it's very engaging with families, and they want to know everything. They don't keep anything out, okay? So two very different methods, but it's working in their communities. Again, everyone can adapt the practice that they have to what's working. So the Bronx, New York, they have a project that works with judges. Because of course, I think sometimes we get in the mindset of caseworkers and CPIs and DCF, but we forget that we have an entire, judicial system, and they are very, very intricate. So in this community, they decided to do a pilot project called Bench Cards. And I think they're still tracking what's going on with this, but I wanted to make sure I mentioned it because I thought it was interesting. So they created cards that judges have on their bench. And these are judges that are making a determination if a child is being removed or not. And there are different questions on these cards, one of which is, could community resources enhance this parent's capacity to take care of their child? And again, I think, this isn't counterintuitive in a sense, but in that moment, they're asking judges to answer that question before they make a ruling. Another question on the cards, if this were a white family, would you make the same decision? It just makes you pause and kind of consider that. Another question was, have exhaustive efforts been made to find family or familial kin? So if a judge looks at that card, it will help him or her be able to look out at a caseworker and ask that question. Well, before I make a ruling, can you explain again what you've done to find familial kin? Can you explain this again? Oftentimes, these questions elicit more questions that the judge can ask the department representatives who are in the courtroom. So that's also a strategy being used somewhere. But it's at a different level. What Ms. Gary said earlier, sometimes we attack certain strategies at certain levels. This is at the judiciary level, which I think is really great, because we forget about them sometimes. Bench cards. There's a pilot in California right now. There's a doctoral student that is interested in what's happening at the front door of child welfare. How do we stop people from coming in at all? So she is interested in requiring a form or documentation that mandated reporters have to complete before calling CPS. On this form, they have to document essentially an attempt at providing resources or providing some advising before they call us, and I still associate myself as being a PI, before they call CPS. And they also have to put on the form some family support networks. This form will be used if the case is accepted by the department, but oftentimes the researcher is hoping that it stops the call from coming in at all. So this process reminds me of the framework Strong Communities. I don't know if you've heard of it. Dr. Melton is the creator of Strong Communities, and it's a prevention network, a prevention framework. where he wants to make it more natural for someone to go next door, go to their neighbor and ask if they can help them rather than call CPS. Because the front door is wide open, at least in Florida. You don't have the burden of proof as a reporter. You have to suspect or have an inkling that something is going on, and then you call us. But we all know what happens when that call comes in and it's accepted. It goes through a process that is very intrusive. So we're really trying to slow that front door down, at least this pilot will. So just consider that. What can be done before calls are coming in, right? This is also similar to a project that we have going on in North Florida called the Assessment Response Team. We call it the ART team, where we have a Florida abuse hotline that takes calls, but then we have a team that reviews the entire case before our protective investigators get it. And sometimes they screen it back to the hotline. So we just, again, another eye, should this have been called in? Can I do something? Because the assessment response team can also provide resources, make some calls, call the reporter, before an investigator goes out through this entirely intrusive process. Again, just another boundary there before it starts heading downstream. You might have heard of blind charging. This is a brand new pilot in San Francisco. And this is more on the criminal justice side, but I think that it not only brings credibility to blind removals in Nassau County, but it's also going to be interesting what they find. So they were interested in seeing if there was no demographic information, if there were differences that came out of that initial decision to charge someone. So they were giving judges and attorneys information without who the person was and only what they did in the history of their criminal justice activity. Again, this just started a few months ago. I am going to be keeping my ear to the ground about what they find. But the guiding question was, would you charge based just on behavior without the race and other demographic information? Now, I will say that what they have found so far is, and it's very preliminary, but it has been making a difference in how they hand down charges. So I think that as we follow what they're doing, it will be interesting. This is the first in the nation and one of the busiest district attorney's offices that are doing anything like this. But when you think about medicine, there are blind clinical trials. You know, blinding the process is not novel, it's just new to child welfare, new to the criminal justice system. So as it relates to legislation, what's happening legislatively? In Minnesota, as many of you might have heard, they are actually pushing a state law called the Minnesota African American Family Preservation Act. It would create a new council inside the State Department that will oversee Black children and families and how they're being treated by Child Protective Services. It sounds a lot like ICWA. And I know we already know how that works with Indian Child Welfare Act. So they're pushing for this new council to be created, and this council would look at cases that come through, again, and advise on what could have been done and what decisions, you know, might have had some negative outcomes, even if the intent was different. Okay? So that's happening in Minnesota. So the next slide talks about awareness and management of bias. So you heard about these foundational and resolving some of the conflictual definitions through Ms. Gary's presentation. And Judge Wright said that many of you have gone through implicit bias training, and that's really great. So I usually talk about this in my presentations because I push the term adaptability. How can you adapt what you're already doing to stop the outcomes for Black and brown kids in our systems? So one of the things I always push is acknowledge your power and privilege. Acknowledge the privilege that you have, whether it's the privilege of an education, the privilege of the color of your skin, the privilege of being an able-bodied person. Privileges are, you know, all over the gamut, right? So acknowledging that you do have privilege and you do have power. When you walk into a family's house, if you're not going into homes, you might be upper leadership. When you're reviewing cases, when you're hearing about a family, you have the power in that situation. I always acknowledge and ask to talk it out with supervisors and coworkers Have check-in meetings about these types of things. That's how you build accountability. The next one ties into that. Always withhold judgment, but commit to accountability. And this is hard when you're trying to shift the culture of an organization. I love what Ms. Gary said about we can change laws and we can change structures, but it really is about values. So if we want to impact the values, we have to have really tough conversations with our colleagues and not judge them and not make them feel awful about being honest. But then we hold them accountable to making that shift in their values. Make an effort to connect people who are different than you. I know that sounds kind of, why do we need to do that? But it's really effective, and research is done on it. When you cross cultures, some people say we have a very multicultural organization, or we have a very multicultural church. I hear that term, but it's a different level when you cross cultures. When you say, I'm going to connect with you, let's go to dinner, let's grab coffee. And if you connect with someone who's extremely different than you, it's going to impact how you connect with families that are very different than you. So that's a really good strategy to have. Again, along the same lines of adaptability and what can you do in your organization, I wanted to talk about tasks of the privileged and tasks of the subjugated. Dr. Kenneth Hardy. So when I met Dr. Kenneth Hardy, maybe it was over 5 years ago, he talked about the privileged and the subjugated, another word for the oppressed. So what are the tasks? Some people often say, what can we do? It's overwhelming. Will this ever change? So one of the things that we can do as people who are privileged, and I will share this about that training that I went through with him. I am and identify with being Black and being female. And I just felt extremely subjugated. I was like, I'm female, I am African American, I don't have any privilege. And I knew that I had some level of privilege, but I was like, I am doubly subjugated. And Dr. Kenneth Hardy really brings out of you what your privilege is, because we all have to acknowledge it and let that guide how we make decisions, right? So one of the things we can do is resist the false notion of equality. It is not helpful to equate suffering. And that goes back to the discussion earlier, equity versus equality. Maybe 6 or 7 years ago, there was a push for Black Lives Matter, but there were some people that persisted that all lives matter, which of course we know and believe, right? But the harmful nature of combating Black Lives Matter with all lives matter is that it's this notion of equality, of no one needs special treatment, no one needs anything different. So that's what that dissonance was when it came to both of those stances. So if you want to acknowledge your privilege and figure out what task you can do, is resist that notion. Goes back to that infographic that you put up, the one that we all see of the people looking over the fence at the game. That's equity, it's not equality. Intentions versus consequences, and we've all heard this. It is not helpful to continue to clarify intentions if consequences were harmful. So as the privileged, and I'm actually guilty of this, not in my professional life, but if someone says that you've hurt them, it's not helpful to continue to repeat what you intended to do. So in child welfare, our intentions are to keep kids safe. Our intentions are to protect children. So we can often say, well, our intention was to keep that child safe. We were moving to keep them safe. That's our intention. But if we are looking at data and listening to community members and community partners about what the consequences have been, it's time to really think about what the consequences are and how we can change what our intentions are. So as the privileged, we have to all check ourselves. We can't continue to say what we're intending to do. We have to focus on what's happening. Another task of the privileged, challenge the ahistorical approach to our work. History matters. I get this a lot when I talk and when I'm speaking. People say, I don't want to hear about the past. I want to focus on today and how to move forward. That really discounts the stories and the identities of a lot of Black and brown people. So if you come into this saying, I don't want to hear about the past, I don't want to hear about how you've been hurt, let's move forward. Let's start today and move ahead, which I agree with. Let's start today, but let's not forget that the past does matter and it informs what we do and how we're moving. Another task of the privileged is to persevere. Don't give up on building relationships with people who are subjugated, even if you are initially rebuffed. And this goes back to the initial slide, crossing cultures. And that can be really hard. Even for an African American woman, when I cross cultures, it's not always easy. But a task of the privileged is to persevere. Don't give up. Don't say, well, I've tried and I'm done. Try again, perhaps with someone different. Okay. So tasks of the subjugated. Overcome learned helplessness and voicelessness. They must advocate for themselves, reject the notion that silence is golden. So when it comes to the families on our caseloads, people in our community, there is a sense of voicelessness that nothing I say will matter. So when I talk to people that identify with certain oppressions and they're subjugated, overcome that. Advocate for yourself. That's what's happening in Palm Beach County. That's what's happening in Broward County. That's what's happening in Franklin County, where they're asking, again, for their voice to be heard, community members. They're asking for not just community members in general, people that have been impacted by the system, people that are still struggling to get their kids back. We want to hear from you. Another task of the subjugated is to overcome the addiction to protect the privileged. So often a subjugated person or persons will become overwhelmed with protecting the privileged or apologizing for the privileged or making the privileged feel comfortable. I don't think anything will change if we remain comfortable. We have to be a little bit uncomfortable for people to start adapting. Okay? Another task of the subjugated is to deal with one's own rage and channel it appropriately. Because it is hurtful and harmful to know that a black child or a Hispanic child or a Native American child is much more likely to be separated from their families simply because of things they cannot change. That is enraging for many people. But even the subjugated have to really channel it appropriately. And this quote talks about why it's so important to channel it appropriately, because shame is a major stumbling block for the privileged, but rage is a major stumbling block for the subjugated. So we both sides of the coin have to manage those things, or we will not move ahead. Right? That's all I have. Thank you. Looking forward to questions or comments. How do you want to do this next segment, Judge Wright? Sure. Now, any reactions or comments? I see a hand. Do you need a mic? Go ahead, ma'am. So kind of an implementation guide, something like that? Mm-hmm. So great question. So I know that in Nassau County, they are about to publish an implementation framework for how to, if you are so inclined to blind removals, how to do that. I cannot say that that's happening for other counties, but I am trying to do what you're saying, compile what they're doing, and at least publish something. So I will say it's in the works, as in my efforts to get what's going on around the country out there. But Nassau County is taking time to really publish a framework around blind removals. So we're working on it. Yes, please take the time to review that website. Our team took a lot of time to put that together, so it's good information. There's a question over here. Yes, sir. The people that were around the table, they work for the department, just the department. But I get that question a lot. Can we bring in people from the community? The answer is yes. I mean, it really depends on your agency and who you think should be around the table. Judge Wright.
Okay, so with the focus groups that have been discussed, yeah, with the focus groups, so our crossover group is talking about getting that going, and we spent a lot of time throwing out names of people that we also recognize cases, but I'm not sure I really can picture how it works. Like, what does that look like when we get it going in terms of running focus groups to inform us in terms of how we can do things better?
So I can answer based on some work being done in Broward County, because it might be synonymous with the focus groups you plan to do. I'm not sure exactly what you all plan to do here, but they recruited people that were on their caseloads. You know, they went to them and asked, are you interested in being a part of a community conversation? So they talked to literally people that were on active caseloads, and then they called up people who had cases that were closed, and they again said, are you interested in being a part of this community conversation? And then they recruited from within. Now, as far as the protocol for questions, they worked with researchers to get some questions for the focus groups, to know what to ask and make sure that it's open-ended and it's not leading. That's kind of how they set that up. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're asking, but yeah. And it really depends on who you want in the room.
And just from the perspective of using that as a tool for inclusion, remember, inclusion is not just about who you speak with. Inclusion, real true inclusion, is shared power. And so it's not enough just to have the focus groups. The question becomes, so how do you now become a partner with us? Do you have a voice in your group for the crossover group? Do you have parent and youth participation, real participation where they become part of decision making? For agencies then, you know, do you have a parent advisory group or youth advisory group that again has shared power in decision making with you? Because that's true inclusion.
Yes, sir.
I think for either of you, what is a strategy for someone who's privileged, using that term, in trying to engage other folks in a community who are also privileged in getting on board with making decisions? Do you have any ideas or strategies, recommendations on pulling other people on board to say this is an issue and we need to combat it together?
You want to try?
Sure.
I have a couple of ideas.
Okay.
I've been hogging the mic.
That's okay. No. One of the strategies that I have, again, going back to being definitional, is calling a thing, and being able to say it's not just enough to say, you know, what is privilege, because some of us have different levels of privilege. Some of it is socioeconomic, some is background. But when we talked about equity or inequity, you had to be explicit. And you're usually always talking about white privilege first, and being able to say that and without people clutching pearls. Because the truth of the matter is, we define white privilege using the research as the set of unquestioned benefits and advantages that people have just from being born white. That's the construct. And so once you get over the ability to say that word, when I first said it, even in our own agency, people were like, "Do you have to say it like that?" Absolutely. Because you want to be authentic to what the conversation is. And then from there, being able to always examine the role and presence of privilege, that privilege in decision making. If you even look in certain agencies or whatever, you can see a lot of persons of color in decision making roles, but when you get to the executive level, they're usually white and male, particularly for judges. And so being able to examine the role and presence of white privilege in that regard, and then also the intersectionality when you have social economic privilege. But if you are a decision maker for a child or a family, you automatically are endowed with a level of privilege that you must acknowledge just from being able to make a decision for children and families.
Thank you. The first thing I wanted to ask was consider what you want those people to contribute to the mission, because if they're mission driven, I think that's the angle that I would take. Your participation, your buy-in, your ownership of this outcome is intricate, and we need you. So it depends on if they're mission driven. I'm not sure if you're talking about community, other colleagues in the community, or community residents. I'm not sure, but that's the angle that a lot of our teams in Florida are taking when we're trying to bring people on board. They're trying to wrap them around the mission, and ultimately the mission is helping all families thrive, especially the most vulnerable. And I mean, it might sound a little bit strange, but you have to find out what angle you can get people. I'm very legislatively inclined in Florida because I have to deal with legislators, and some people's bottom line is fiduciary. They want to know how this is going to impact our economy. And if you study this stuff long enough, you know that racial equity does impact the economy in a positive way. If we stop having droves of black and brown kids coming into care, it will impact the economy in a good way. So sometimes we have to talk about it like that. So that's one strategy. Sometimes you talk about it when a legislator, it depends on if they know someone personally, or it's storytelling. Storytelling works really well in Florida as well. Bringing somebody to tell a story, or you yourself standing before community stakeholders and talking about a case, and they look at it and they say, I had no idea that the child welfare system did things like this. We have a new secretary in our state who's not from child welfare at all, and it's been really refreshing to have kind of new set of eyes on our child welfare system. And there have been discussions of the things that we've, in quotes, always done, and he asks really tough questions that I think some of you might be taken aback by, but he'll say things like, why do we do that? How long have we been doing that? Why did you all think that would work? And sometimes it comes off as maybe, like he's trying to be what's the term, the devil's advocate, but I think he's really curious, and it makes us have to really reevaluate. So I think that calling people to the table and letting them know exactly what we're doing is also a good strategy, and sometimes that's done through storytelling. I hope that was helpful. Yes, sir.
So Derek just asked about speaking to, as a privileged person speaking to other privileged people. I was somewhat hinging on Derek's question about privilege speaking to privilege. But then I keep wondering about Dr. Hardy's work with the tasks of the subjugated. So who's, how are the subjugated, developing within those tasks? And it's always been awkwardness is a gross understatement in the position of privilege overall, which is why shame is kind of the thing that always holds people up. But when the person of privilege is then tasked with educating the subjugated with their tasks, it seems like exponentially imperfect. So what's the appropriate way for these tasks to be accomplished?
So I don't know if it is the privileged job, is it their job to educate the subjugated on their tasks? But if you could co-create an environment where these discussions can happen, but just changing the frame of, don't come in thinking that you're responsible, for them and for their tasks. But I think having a safe, vulnerable environment where you can talk about this stuff is going to go a long way. I mean, that's what I would say.
Yeah, and I would add to that in terms of understanding their task or whatever. What are, as part of the privilege, what are you doing to create the space where they can not only embrace that task, but also be able to articulate it for themselves? Because they may identify voicelessness and call it something else. They may be called being shut out or shut up. And so again, I think just going into it, like how do we go about equipping or educating them about their task is a little bit different. And I mean, inherent in that, though I know it wasn't intentional, is a level of privilege. Because they should be able to define that for themselves as well. And not only in terms of what their tasks are, but also what they think your task should be. And that, again, goes back to creating an environment where you do have a role for everyone, and it's articulated fluidly as well as collaboratively.
And I will add, connecting to what Judge Wright said at the very beginning of the forum about, and it ties back to Emma Ketteringham. I mentioned her in my TED Talk. She's an attorney. But when it comes to owning your privilege and talking to people around you, people who might be at your dinner table, you know, I think that a lot of these discussions happen in forums like this or at work, but sometimes these discussions start also at home. Okay? So Emma Ketteringham is an attorney in the Bronx, and one thing I love about her is she's not only an ally, but this is her life work. She's like, I'm a privileged person, and I want to acknowledge my privilege and give people space to be who they are. So she talks about clients like Black moms. Her whole job is representing African-American moms who've lost their kids. She works in the Bronx for the Bronx Defenders. And she said when a African-American mom comes in her office, she's usually really angry. Again, the rage, the subjugated person is very, very angry. And Emma Ketteringham often says, she tells her, you have the right to be angry. You have the right not even to like me. You probably don't even trust me. Again, what Judge Wright said earlier, the system has an aura of mistrust. They don't trust us. They don't trust you as a judge. They don't trust you as a caseworker. And acknowledging that, I understand why you don't trust me. That's what Emma Ketteringham tells her clients. But I'm here to work with you. I'm here to advocate for you. But I understand why even me saying that isn't enough. She's a very inspiring person because I don't know a lot. I'm a social worker, I'm a child welfare person, but to hear an attorney or a judge say she connects with clients and says, you're angry and you should be. If I were in your shoes, I'd be just as angry, if not more. This is what she tells her clients. So again, going back to your question, I don't think she's educating them, but she's giving them a space to feel what they're feeling, and she's validating it as a privileged person. Yes, yes. I hope that was helpful. Yes.
So just to dovetail on that, one thing we've been talking about in our group is because of the just natural and understandable resistance, both of the youth who are older and who really don't have any desire to stop having fun, the fun that they're having, or the PJS system, that's not looking at DSS, but then with the parents of both PJS and DSS sides that do, you know, they feel judged, even if they've been trying hard, they feel like, you know, everybody's coming in and giving them lists of things that they have to do that they either don't know how to do or can't do and such. Is there a role in all of this for peer support so that there's somebody with whom that parent or that youth really could connect with and maybe have a more natural rapport than people coming in within the system? And if there is such a role, how would one do that? How would one get that going?
I would like to mention the work group that Tiffany and I are on. We do have a colleague on that work group that is a parent partner. Now, we don't have that model in Florida, but I have been learning a lot about that model on this work group, and she is exactly, I think, what you're describing. She partners with the parents that are going through the system, and she has a lived experience where I believe her children were removed out of her care, and she had to work to get them back. So now she works with parents alongside them. So how to get that going? I think you have to, if there's a funding stream that needs to happen, of course, work organizationally to hire a parent who wants to advocate for that, and then start connecting her or him with parents that are going through the system. I think it's an amazing model. I wish we had it in Florida. But yeah, that is happening.
And it's happening here in Maryland through our family engagement. We have parent peer support, and that is families who have already been involved in the system, working with other families to help them deal with different stages of decision making, helping them to understand what different terminology is. When I was a case manager, I used the term ignorantly when I was talking to a parent, and I'm sure it came off as such, adjudicatory. And she absolutely did not know what that meant. And so being able to define things. But one of the things I push back and I challenge our agency on, as well as other system partners that we deal with, i.e. the court, the state's attorney, public defenders, is also think about yourself. I am a parent. I'm a parent of a 15-year-old. He'll be 16 this month. He is not the child I had a couple of years ago. I don't know who this one is, but Lord. If I had an issue with him, when I have an issue with him, do you tell me what I need, or do you ask me what can I do to support you? And see, when it comes to kids, particularly in the juvenile justice system, they usually get a long laundry list of, i.e. a court order of all these things they must do. But should I be held accountable for doing functional family therapy if I did not tell you that I wanted to participate or that I felt as though I needed functional family therapy? So some of that is not necessarily how you navigate the system, but also what system do we create for them? Again, remembering the boxes and what they need, they have to understand and be able to climb up on those boxes and take advantage of the opportunity, not have it shoved down their throat. And so I am not a proponent of pushing parents into treatment that they themselves do not have any self-realization about. So part of that parent support is helping another family who has gone through counseling, whether it's MST or functional family therapy, helping them bring that family along in terms of these are the benefits if you participate, and if you don't participate, what are your other options? Because that is giving the voiceless a voice. That's increasing their agency.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm really glad you talk about time frames because I think especially in child welfare, we have time frames associated with reunification efforts and CPR and what we know about maybe domestic violence situations or, new cycles of change of substance use or even a new concept that I realized that we have going on within our department is this two-generation aspect of multi-generation use of systems and how that sort of systematic expression comes out in time frames. Is there any work being done to address time frames and how that specifically affects people of color?
So I can speak to timeframes as it relates to substance abuse allegations or maltreatment codes, but that's the extent of what I know about that. I know that a lot of places say if your child is removed, you have 12 months to follow a case plan, and if you don't, especially with some legislation, you could potentially start having your parental rights terminated. But they are reevaluating the time frame specifically because of addiction. And because within 12 months, it's just not realistic to think somebody could reverse an addiction that's been so deeply rooted. So that's one thing that I think they're moving the needle on looking at the timeframes and being a little bit more flexible as it relates to substance misuse and abuse. But I appreciate your question because that should be applied for a lot of other issues, even trauma or mental health, not just substance misuse. 12 months might seem like a long time, but it's really not. When you really think about partnering with someone through a very challenging experience and partnering with people who are in persistent poverty. 12 months is hard to reverse poverty as well. So great question. Great question. That's a hand in the back. I'm sorry, I didn't get all of it. Okay. So you're asking, are there things happening in Florida that would help the transition of a child into a foster parent's home? Yes, not as it relates specifically to culture or things of that nature, but there is a case manager that comes out and they talk about what's going on with the child. I think it's very standard, that kind of transitional interview drop-off type of thing. But I hear you. I mean, that would be really important to do, especially if the child is of a different race or ethnicity than the foster parents.
Can I ask you, what do you think? Like, what are you seeing? What are the challenges that you see?
children as well.
The reason why I asked you, thank you for sharing. The reason why I asked that question, because that is a prime example when I talk about examining the role and presence of privilege and understanding that the role of privilege sets a standard. It sets the standard to how everything should be and how youth and children should act, how families should act, what the structure should be, and that's part of our problem. So part of the culture and some of the stumbling blocks or challenges in adapting kids, and that's not just for foster care, but even kids going in and out of our facilities. For example, most of our youth centers are here in Western Maryland, and many of those kids come from Baltimore City and Prince George's County. And when you talk to those kids, with predominantly black male children, they share with us that they feel very much outside of their culture here in Western Maryland. And so the question for me, the conversation becomes, what makes you feel that way? And so some of the things start coming up about how they don't feel like they meet this standard, or they've been criticized about, how they may speak or things of that nature. So again, part of understanding the role and the presence of privilege is understanding how it sets a dominant culture to which everyone is modeled, everyone is measured and held accountable to. So even speaking as a black female, if you have a black child who's coming into foster care or any kind of care, and you don't know anything about black hair care products, that's a problem on you, and you need to learn, because that's a big part of that child's existence. That makes sense to you?
Also, I wanted to add, because you sparked this, we also talk to youth in Florida, particularly teenagers, and some of them are crossover youth, about how can we improve the system? How can we improve their experience? How has it been for them? And we hear things like, I don't get to see my siblings enough. We've had a teenager tell us, I had visitation with my sister, but it triggered something in me, and then I didn't have any support afterwards. So we're thinking, oh, we're doing the right thing. We're letting her visit her sister or visit her brother, but then it uncovers all of this trauma, and then she just goes back to the foster parent, and that's it. So it just really opened our eyes to a lot of things. One thing that she said that kind of connects to what you said is one of the youth shared that she didn't want her foster parents to know certain things about her. And she felt like she had no privacy at all. And that gets kind of tough, right? We're all professionals. We're thinking, well, we need to let our foster parents know what's going on. We need to make sure that everybody's, in the know. But she said, I wish there was, I'm talking to therapists, I'm talking to counselors, I have a guardian ad litem, I'm talking about all these really personal things, and then I have to live with somebody who knows all about me, and I've never met them. She said the first day she met this person, it was like, again, think about you meet someone, they know everything about you. So that was something that really made us think, how can we, that's kind of a tough and complex issue, but I think you're right. There should be some level of transition where it relates to making sure the child is okay, and not just safely okay, but safely, even emotionally safe. Not just physically safe, but emotionally safe. But it was a great project we did, but it opened up a lot of, okay, now what do we do? Because we heard a lot.
So I feel like a lot of times when you have roundtable meetings and things like that, it's based off of success stories for parents and for children. So
excuse me, I'm sorry. Could you start over?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
That's okay.
Okay. So I feel like a lot of times when you have meetings, it's based off of success stories for parents and for children, and a lot of policy revolves around how we succeeded. But I feel like oftentimes parents and children who struggle to complete all of their tasks and everything like that get left behind. So do you have any advice on how to include them more into the topic and make their voice really feel like they're actually being heard, since they're not succeeding? So it's like they're kind of stuck in a wavering place.
So what I will say to that is, I think that as a country, we have put, I think I said it in my TED Talk, unrealistic standards and tasks for a person that is in a crisis. And when you say the term, I know exactly what you mean when you say they're not succeeding, but I think a way to reframe that is to kind of, again, say, we're partnering with you on this journey. It may not be very crisp and cut and dry, Although you may not have hit this mile marker or this benchmark, you have had some successes. So I think the way to handle that, this is just a suggestion, is to talk about what they have succeeded. I'm putting quotes around that, but what have they accomplished? You know, what have they done so far? Because I don't want to make it seem like, well, there's a subset of our parents who are failing or not succeeding. I think they might be having more challenges along a journey that maybe somebody else, you know, swiftly went through with more support, perhaps more privilege, different types of privilege. Completing a case plan is not easy. I knew someone personally who had a case plan, and I mean, she was an educated person and, you know, all these things, and it's a lot. It's a lot of red tape to go through, and it's a lot of judgment, and it's a lot of, it's a lack of privacy, and we all deserve some level of privacy. So I would say think about the small successes, I'm gonna use that term again, that they might be having, and frame it around that, and partner with them, and talk to them. And I always say elevate those stories. In Florida, when we do a map of a case, we look at what really went well, what didn't go so well, and then what went really well and what didn't go well, and talk about it at each of those points.
And I would advise that there are no families or children who don't succeed. There are family and children who we fail because we didn't provide what they needed. Again, remember the equity and the little guy with the box? If we give you a box that requires you to have a box to get on another box in order to reach the box that we gave you, we have failed you. It should be something that's attainable and that's accessible, and it gives them a voice not only in what it looks like or how but also how they define success. And that varies according to systems. For DJS, we define success of kids successfully completing probation, doing so without reoffense, coming into the community and aftercare, you know, from placement or whatever, and not committing another offense. We look at recidivism a lot, but there are other small measures of success that family must be able to realize. And so just because I, as a system person in my position, if I see it as a privilege to you, an opportunity, or I'm mitigating burden to you, you must see it as such. And if you have a family or a child who does not see a program or a service or a treatment modality as an opportunity for them, then either we failed to communicate the effects of it or we have failed to identify the right modality.
Great question. Yes, Judge Wright? He's getting his exercise today.
Well, Daniel was fabulous. He's done all of the data organization. He just is terrific. So I guess my question is, with the data that's been collected, is there any separation out of the female population, minority female population? And I personally feel like, and this is true of our teenagers, whether they're in the DSS side or in the DJS side, I feel like they have a unique path to try to seek inclusion, whether it's in a self-destructive sense or not. You know, I think of the boys as being sort of, you know, drawn into the gang, the sort of tribe, when they're looking for inclusion and such. The young women that we're dealing with, you know, on the extreme example, end up being trafficked, sexually trafficked. On the less extreme example, they're gravitating toward men through their sexuality many times to look for that feeling of inclusion that they are missing. And so I'm wondering if there are any stats sort of separating out the boys from the girls and how we're grappling with that. And I guess I don't know that we're doing a terrific job for our girls. That's one question, and I'll save my other one for later.
So I'll probably be pretty brief, and I'll see if you have anything to add, Lisa. I will talk from the human trafficking standpoint. There's a lot of data on that, especially in Florida. I mean, a lot of places in the country, but Florida is definitely really struggling to be able to not only identify people that are trafficked, but what do we do after that? So overwhelmingly, they're women, they're young girls that are being trafficked. So the data is showing that. Family First legislation has been passed down, and that is requiring that group homes have an element of human trafficking, trauma-informed care for trafficked youth, a nurse at the group home, a clinical director at some group homes. So I guess one of your questions was what's kind of moving, what's happening with that? I think Family First is a good step toward, if you have identified somebody as trafficked, highly likely this will be a female, a cisgendered female, then I think that Family First will be able to at least have a group home that has evidence-based trauma-informed care that is going to be specifically for a person who's dealing with being trafficked. But that is, to me, that is the most salient division of gender data as it relates to human trafficking. There are males, but not very many in Florida.
The difference is unpacking intersectionality between race and gender, sometimes race and poverty, sometimes race, poverty, and affection orientation. And so as we get kids who come into our detention centers, into our placement facilities, let's say when they are transitioning, our LGBTQ youth, most times there are some other issues there with them that as we're dealing with them, you're dealing with multiple layers of their feeling othered. So they're being othered racially. They feel othered because of their affection orientation. They're feeling othered because if it's a female because of her gender. And so there are all these different layers to unpack. And so I don't think that, even if we collected data, we can't automatically say it's because of one particular thing, because of the nuances of intersectionality. But one of the commonalities that we usually come back to all the time is race and poverty, and complications because of race and poverty. So.
Question though.
Nobody else?
Sure.
Okay.
Judge Wright.
All right. So with the data to suggest that we may not be doing a spectacular job in out-of-home placements, or maybe we could be doing a better job in out-of-home placements, or regardless of how great we're doing, it's harmful to the youth to be pulled away from their family and their communities and everything that they know, whatever positive supports are there are lost in the sweep into out-of-home placements. Is there any movement afoot nationally or even the state of Maryland with EJS to look at some kind of hybrid between the two, whereas we, on the SINA side of things, we say, well, that parent can't safely parent, because of all of the things we're expecting, all the judgment and everything we expect of that parent on that side. On the DJS side, that child needs more supervision than that family can provide, and so they're being unsafe for themselves or for other people in the community. So when I say hybrid, I mean, well, is there some kind of movement afoot to do something that is, instead of, the in-community services are 1 hour of therapy per week, 2 hours of substance abuse per week, and go to school, and the parent's still responsible for doing all that running. What about something more extensive, like that kid is supervised in a program during the day, but it's more of a one-stop shop where they're getting all of the benefits, but maybe the kid is home at night where there are not as many hours that we need that parent to be stepping up or doing a good job. I mean, is there any movement toward looking at something off the extreme?
The only thing that I would say about that is you all are here, as a few other counties in Maryland, working on that. I haven't heard anything nationally in terms of a hybrid between youth justice and child welfare. Not one that's strong enough and solid enough with results to put up numbers. But that was part of the crossover project anyway, is to create that. And one of the things I would encourage you about here, particularly as the leader here, Judge Wright, to be innovative and to be bold and step out and create your own. I don't have a national model from a justice perspective. Dr. Pryce may, but you all are on the precipice of doing some of that through your crossover collaboration and being able to say, what does this look like? And because you know both systems intimately, you define it. You have a blueprint. That's you have the courage then to lead that effort and to create that hybrid. And we'll help you market it.
Such a great question. When I first started my job in Florida, we called it a meeting tour, but I went around the entire state. It took over 3 months talking to people about what are their most significant challenges in child welfare. I would have to say over 90% of them said hard to place youth. You're kind of describing them, the youth that the parents are saying, I don't know what else to do, and foster parents are saying, I'm not comfortable with them being here, and they haven't risen to the level of getting into a commitment program, and now they're sleeping at our DCFS office. I mean, that's literally what I was hearing. So of course I left feeling very overwhelmed about how we're gonna fix this or how we're gonna establish something that will help this particular subset. So I will say that it's complex, and I don't know what's happening at the national level, but I do know that a hybrid system sounds very, very keen and very, very unique and important, because in our state, we have recently moved toward putting those children in a quote, lockdown kind of center, and it has garnered a lot of controversy about what that is going to look like. And I don't think that decision was made lightly. I think that it was made with the best of intentions, but there's a lot of discussion around, was that the right choice? Because again, they haven't broken the law, they haven't done something like that, but again, like what you're saying, they need to be supervised, and we need some level of safety for them as well. So I don't think that anyone has figured that out, Judge Wright. So I echo what Lisa said, that this county could be a leader in that, because I think it's needed.
You definitely need to have an after this mentality, because after placement, after the involvement of any one agency, there's still an after this for these kids. And so for us, I've always struggled with out-of-home placement for kids who are committed to our custody, and them going back to the same dysfunction where nothing has changed. The family's still dysfunctional, the community's still dysfunctional, they've been kicked out, expelled from schools that if they were admitted are dysfunctional. And so the question becomes, what are we doing while they're in placement to create some stabilization for them? So whatever you do for the hybrid, it has to have an after this. Even for child welfare, there's some reunification or some type of migration to an independent living situation. So again, thinking about what placement looks like, not from where do they go, but where do they go after this. That's the most important part of the planning to me.
I think we have a few more minutes if there's more questions. So I wanted to piggyback on the very first question we got about, where can we get kind of more, blueprint type of information as far as what's going on. I will make sure that I send that over as soon as I get, at least the blind removal framework is coming out in the next few weeks. I'll send that over to Judge Wright and make sure Tracy has it. Sorry, Tiffany has it. My sister's name is Tracy, and she just called me, so. And I saw her name flash on my phone. So I'll make sure Tiffany has it and Judge Wright, and I will continue my efforts in getting these other counties written up, at least even if it's a one-pager about how they went about doing their efforts. If you have any questions today about any of these efforts, I can also try to answer them verbally, but I'll still work on getting that written out. So thank you for your time.
Okay, so thank you, ladies. Please give a warm thank you